All right, everybody, welcome to week 3 of Rekindle the Flame. I'm your host, Rachel Collins. We are covering a crazy 4 books tonight, so strap in, we're going to move, beginning with Galatians. So when was Galatians written? Textual evidence would say anywhere from 51 to 57, but the letters don't provide clear data on that in relation to Paul's other works. One way of thinking about Galatians is thinking about it coming into the third act of a play. You don't know all of the things, but you're assuming some details in order to understand what's really being said. So the church in Galatia was founded by Paul, not in his first missions like in Jerusalem or Antioch, but rather in a later part of Paul's ministry in a separate mission called the Aegean mission. And that's when Paul operated without appealing to the churches in Antioch and Jerusalem to be sent to these new places to share the good news. And we hear about that specifically in the 4th chapter in verses 8 and 9, where he talks about converting pagans. And then he gives his defense of his credentials, essentially, by going back to Jerusalem. Like his other congregations, they were taught to understand themselves as incorporated into God's ongoing plan in history and incorporated into the story of Israel. That they should adopt the Jewish text, which we refer to as the Old Testament, what is known as the Tanakh. But here's the rub. They don't have to follow the rules and laws of the Mosaic covenant. Mainly, they don't have to uphold ritual cleanliness or dietary restrictions, and you guessed it, circumcision. They were taught by Paul that they were accepted by God into the holy people of the covenant, apart from the markers that set apart Jewish Christians who were first Jews and therefore followed the law. All of this is going well with the church. Paul has trained some leaders to guide the church and feels confident, so he leaves to go on with his mission. And that's when the arrival of rival missionaries comes in. These missionaries are Jewish Christians, meaning they uphold the covenant laws, and they have been sent from Jerusalem. They saw themselves as an advocate of a complete faith, not the incomplete one that Paul teaches that does not require circumcision. And they displace Paul's teachings and his leaders with their own, and that's where this letter comes in. Paul hears of the defection and writes this letter. Now, there are some real high points in this book that I would love to hit. In the beginning of chapter 1, we have the main thesis statement that then is backed up through the rest of the book. There is no other gospel. The gospel is the saving, liberating power of God unleashed in the world by the Christ event, period. The authority of the apostles is only as interpreters, period. Even though Paul aggressively defends his apostleship, it's not about Paul, which I think sometimes Paul needs to be reminded of himself, but we also need to be reminded about it. It's always about God. It's always about the Christ event. So Paul's theological argument comes next, and you can really see 2 main pillars that he goes with, and you can see the veins of those running through the rest of the book. Number 1, Paul is the authentic disciple, and what you have received from him is all that you need because it declares you as a people of God. And number 2, you already have what these people are offering, and you know it because of your experience in the scriptures. Now, as a United Methodist people, we can get behind this last one for sure because we look at the Christian experience through the lens of scripture, reason, experience, and tradition. So we definitely like this part. The rest of chapters 1 and 2 talk at length about the work that Paul has done and the ways in which he did the mission before checking in with Jerusalem to make sure that his theology was straight. For Paul, the truth of the gospel is at stake, not so much his personal status, and that's really given to us in chapter 2, verse 5. Now, there are 7 theological arguments that Paul uses against the other missionaries in chapters 3 and 4. So the first one, the Galatians have already experienced the power of the Holy Spirit. They know this from their own experience of faith before these people came along, and they don't have to wait for a supplement to complete their faith that was offered by the other missionaries. The Spirit acts without waiting for doctrine and theology to keep up. And 2, in verse 6 through 9, Abraham was justified by God before being circumcised. And it's cool that Paul refers back to the Old Testament to refute the law itself, right? He doesn't appeal to the sayings of Jesus, but rather to the promise of God that was made with Abraham. And the thing that really perplexed Paul and really the whole community as they tried to establish some norm within the new movement was, how does the law, the Old Testament, the foundation scriptures relate to things after the Christ event, the law to the gospel to faith, the law to faith? All of those things are still getting worked out. But with his argument here, it's really wrapped up in Genesis 15:6, which says, and he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And this is right after God has told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. So by saying this, Paul is measuring those who believe as Abraham. They are also blessed as Abraham was blessed. Number 3, this comes from chapter 3, verses 10 through 14. The law does not add something positive to what you already have, but brings a curse from which Christ has already delivered believers. Again, Paul refers back to the Torah to refute Torah law adherence, which is smart. Leviticus 18:5, Deuteronomy 27:26, Deuteronomy 21:23, back to Genesis 15:6. Basically, his arguments here is that if you enter into the realm of the law, then you're subjecting yourself to the bad things that happen if you don't adhere to it properly. Now, number 4. The law came 430 years after the covenant with Abraham and could add nothing to what Abraham and his heirs had already received by faith. Paul plays in this section off the meaning of covenant, an arguing that once a will is established, then it cannot be modified by later additions of someone else, right? In this case, it would be Moses. The idea of the law being a schoolmaster or a guardian, depending on your translation, this is seen as largely negative by Paul. Paul doesn't argue that baptism replaces circumcision, rather that circumcision after baptism isn't necessary because they are already full members of the holy people of God. And so that's when there's this line, this great line of there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, male and female, etc. Because they already belong to Christ. They are already heirs of Abraham and heirs to the promise made to him in Genesis. Number 5. This begins chapter 4 and covers kind of the same thing, but from a pagan bent. You've already been freed from slavery to the elemental spirits of the universe. And this actually includes all of the oppressive forces of the world, of which there are many. God sending forth Christ in the fullness of time puts humanity and really the whole of creation on this path of salvation. Paul continues to appeal to the community's already experienced presence of God before they were required to do all of these other things. And I think that's really cool. Number 6, chapter 4, 12 through 20 basically says, you've already accepted me and my message from God, so now why would I be your enemy? Paul has a real pastoral heart here as he appeals to the circumstances under which they met, i.e. his illness, and then the distance with which the other missionaries keep themselves, like they are apart from the community, whereas Paul was one of them working alongside of them. He has a mother's heart for them, and he expresses that through the phrase, I'm again in the pain of childbirth. Number 7. We finally made it to the ends of these appeals. This final one spills over into chapter 5, but it essentially is saying that the rival missionaries have bad theology. Their understanding of Abraham and in the understanding of what Paul says about Abraham are very different. And the rival missionaries have set their agenda on Abraham's covenant being exclusive and dependent on Mosaic law, which means that the law needs to be upheld, but Paul maintains that the addition of one does not undo the promise of the other. With Paul's symbolic interpretation of the Sarah and Hagar comparison, he, in my opinion, is giving the group permission to throw out the other teachers. Paul had a pretty broad theology at times, but he says that this is not just a different understanding, but a completely different gospel story that they are preaching. So I have 2 favorite verses in Galatians chapter 1, 10b. If I were still pleasing people, I would not be a servant of Christ, for obvious reasons. And the second is here in chapter 5, verse 6. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. Except there is a bit of debate about the translation of the word working. It can also be made effective. So let's hear that again. The only thing that counts is faith made effective through love. I adore that line. There's a freedom and love found in the love of God, and that's established not through works, but through faith. And faith is active in love, and it is a radical understanding of grace and acceptance of people that are struggling to be a community. And that's a beautiful word for us. God's love has set us free for a life of service to each other and to others, not to the rigidity of orthopraxy. The works of the Spirit and the flesh, this is hard. We talk about this a lot sometimes in church. I don't believe that Paul is challenging the Galatians to live into some ridiculous Christian ideal. I think he is speaking about what happens when a community is empowered to care for one another. He's just finished this idea of us being slaves to one another, right? Bearing one another's responsibilities, bearing one another's burdens is not only the responsibility of the strong, but a promise to the weak. Each are not alone, but are supported by a compassionate, caring community that are members of a family in which there is mutual care. And this is the law of Christ. Love is the summary of the law. And we get another throwback to Leviticus 19:18. You shall love the Lord. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Paul wraps all of this up by reminding us that the church in the world is the job of the church in the world is to represent God's care for the whole of creation, regardless of the world's response. A theologian named Richard Hayes wrote, both Augustine and Martin Luther took their bearings from Paul's message of radical grace, apart from the works of the law. Thus, the letter to the Galatians is a fountainhead for all subsequent theological reflections about justification by faith, the cross and the power of the Spirit, and the meaning of Christian freedom. The letter was preserved by the church and cherished because it offers a compelling model for how we think theologically about challenges faced in community life. And I think that's an incredibly powerful statement to wrap up our time in Galatians. So next up, we have 1 Thessalonians. Remember way back to the beginning of Galatians when I talked about the Aegean mission, 1 Thessalonians was towards the beginning of Paul's Aegean ministry. Paul wrote this probably about 17 years after his conversion and had already been instrumental in founding several churches, and has the work of a seasoned missionary and mature theologian at this point. Paul and Silvanus have arrived in Thessalonica about 50 CE after having been arrested in Philippi. They were the first Christian missionaries to the area, and they remained there for a long time. I'm going to call Thessalonica Thess from here on out because it will save a little bit of time. The context of the city is it was a big city important for trade and politics. It was very loyal to the Romans and had several big Greco-Roman cults that ruled the religious scene. The Jewish communities of Thess had definitely figured out how to negotiate that structure. While Paul and his few dozen converts didn't pose a huge threat, the idea of an alternate king of a kingdom could upset the symbiosis already established. And it did, in fact. The Jewish community had a big problem with Paul and they had to leave, but the new converts had to continue to struggle with that after he left. While the structure of the Galatians was a little easier to define, there are less clear lines here in 1 Thess. Paul is definitely more focused on personal relationships, worship, thanksgiving as a whole. This community, though they had to leave suddenly, was a place of healing for them after the group left Philippi. So the structure of the book has a greeting, a thanksgiving, a reminder of the reception that the Thessalonians gave to them before, a reminder of their work, their labor, and their hope for one another. And that's all in the first chapter. That's a lot to cover. The big line in chapter 1 is being imitators of the Lord and of Paul. Now, Paul is really grateful that they have remained strong in their time of suffering. Paul has described the work of the Thessalonians in 3 parts, a way that's almost creedal. They turned to God from idols, to serve a living God, and to wait for the Son from heaven. This is tripart, right? The past, present, and future. God's saving acts point both to the past and the future, and we'll get to those in chapters 4 and 5. But we see their present hope and their service to the living God. In chapter 2, we get more of Paul talking about apostolic ministry, specifically his ministry and calling. Now, this was really common in Hellenistic writing. That's the word for Greek culture of the time. Paul would be making claims of his own competency and honesty, not so much to be like, hey, look at me, but because if he didn't make claims like that, it would be out of the ordinary and call up questions for the people. This is really more a letter of friendship and continued cultivation of friendship from across difficulties and distance. Paul is thankful to God for the calling of the Thessalonians, and we get some really cool theology thrown in here that goes throughout the letter. God has elected, that's in 1:4, called in 2:12, works within the community in 2:13, directs the mission of the church in 3:11, teaches believers in 4:9, and sanctifies. We can throw that back to 2:18. The initiative of the relationship with God lies in God's hands, but Christians must take responsibility for their own actions while walking along the road with God. It's a pretty encompassing narrative for the community then and now. We have to take responsibility for our relationship with God, even though God is the driving force. But at the end of chapter 2, verses 14 through 20, we need to be a little careful with this. We don't want to read it with an anti-Semitic vibe. In the context of the letter, they are meant to be encouraging to the New Thessalonian Christians by exhibiting continuity with the original church in Judea and their place in the ongoing acts of God. God's people suffer is like inherent in their calling as manifest by Christ and the prophets and even Paul. In chapter 3, we see good news brought by Timothy that restores the hope of Paul while in prison. And in the last part of chapter 3, we have a summary and a prayer all wrapped together. For Paul, the work of Jesus and the work of the church are summed up into action. The love command, a love directed not only to the insider of the congregation, but outwards to the whole of God's creation. And we will hear Paul come back to this theme in 5:15. There's a powerful word for us as we think about what it means to be living out the work and the values in the Bible as we work our way through the New Testament, right? How this becomes something that's actionable for us. Chapters 4 and 5 give some pretty practical advice to the community. The life to which Christians are called is a life that is pleasing to God, a life that's industrious and quietly lived and focused on the love of the world. At this time, the idea that Christ was going to return any day now was very prevalent, and in Paul's early ministry, he expresses this theology openly. It's really here where we see the beginning of this shift, where Paul is realizing that Christ isn't coming back like right now, so that living a good and godly life is something that the community needs to be a little more focused on, since it's not imminent, right? Because of the earlier understanding, some people were just living off the church and biding their time. A life pleasing to God, as Paul states, is one that's industrious in the working of loving others, living quietly, and making disciples of Christ. The end of chapter 4 and into chapter 5 give more insight into the changing theology around Paul's eschatology, understanding of the end times. This section is really pastoral care for a grieving community. Members of the church have died and they're distressed. The community is concerned about the people who have died and if they have missed out on a life with God eternally. And Paul's answer is clear: no. God will bring them with Christ. We will explore a more developed theology of those who have died later in Paul's writings that I think addresses this as he matures in his own theology and understanding. But it's still a mystery that we have to hold. Paul's benediction is lovely and encouraging to people that are mourning and to people that are frankly a little bit of troublemakers. This is a tight-knit group that Paul cares for deeply, and I think you can tell that as you've read through this. 2 Thessalonians is a fairly quick book to make your way through. The largest sect of scholarship these days says that the book of Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, was written by another author, maybe Timothy, while Paul was still alive, potentially to correct his theology at the end. It could have been written by another Paulinist to the church at large, or it was written by members of the Pauline school in the 80s or 90s to reinterpret eschatology in 1 Thess. Regardless, we get a lot of the same themes: persecution, eschatology, and the idlers. Persecution is largely addressed here in the first chapter, and it shifted from the idea that the church just in Thessalonica is suffering for their faith to all Christians are enduring this challenge. And it has been spun in this apocalyptic universal light. All are suffering until Christ returns. The writer does have a moment about people who are not a part of the community, but they don't really dwell on this, but it does say something interesting. It says this: these will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction, separated from the presence of the Lord and the glory of his might. I think for me, this gives light to my own understanding of what it is for damnation or hell, and that is that it will be a separation from the presence of God and from the separation of relationship, and that would be painful and hard. The writer here is really moving away from the idea that the end times are right around the corner. We've taken another step back from that, even from 1 Thess. It's a reestablishment of apocalyptic hope. The Lord has not yet come in the experience of believers, nor is it likely to happen soon. So they can rest easy. This hasn't happened yet. They haven't been left. This is the point of the apocalyptic scenario that the writer shares. They aren't interested in having a calendar, but in refuting false expectations and excuses for lazing about. Don't be idle. We're not waiting for this to happen in the next few days or in the next few years. Be doing something to be a Christian. Live for love, right? Life for Christians should be about praying for missionaries, not being idle, but working towards a good life with community and with God. And there's also a shift in the time that we suspect that this was written, where resident pastors are becoming more the norm, which Paul disagrees with on a fundamental level, which we'll get really in the middle of chapter 3. It's a shift of congregations supporting pastors, and we read more about that shift in the pastoral letters of Titus and Timothy, so wait for that to come later. And that's really the Second Thessalonians book, pretty swift and just kind of an addition to First Thess. Now we're into Philippians. I can't believe it. In Acts 16 through 40, Paul and the crew were instructed to go to Philippi. Now, Philippi was a big Roman colony with roads going to and from the city. In typical Paul fashion, we have a greeting and thanksgiving for the community. This is another familiar friendship letter without as much contention as 2 Thessalonians. Paul is in prison again, but the gospel is continuing to flourish, and that is something to give thanks for on a regular basis. Paul is constantly evaluating his situation and the situation of the community from the point of view of the gospel, of God's saving acts in Christ, and the role that he has been called to play in that mission. Now, there are several themes that are elaborated upon later in the book that are laid out at the end of chapter 1. So let's look at this. Number 1. Conducting yourself as a citizen of the realm to which you belong. Now, in Philippi, having Roman citizenship was a big deal. It was important to how you were treated. Even as a diaspora Jew, they had special protections under the law, but Christians fall into a very different category. And Paul pushes that being a citizen of heaven, that's the important part for them, even if that means that they will be treated poorly on earth, right? And we get that really elaborated in chapter 3, verse 20. Number 2, stand firm in your faith, because there are going to be struggles with threats and oppositions to the Philippian Christian movement. Number 3, there's a strong theme of unity that's woven into the remainder of the book. One Spirit, meaning the Spirit of God, is that which unifies the church. And number 4, the soon-to-be manifest glory of God will be revealed, and it will be clear that they are on the right side of the empire. Right? So chapter 2 really begins with the push of unity. Unity against opponents to show the difference that community makes with just like the humility and obedience that Christ has shown. And this is where we get the Christ hymn. This is one of the earliest hymns of the Christian church, and it comes in verses 5 through 11 in chapter 2. The section tells us exactly who God is, who Christ is, and the importance of Christ, the Christ event, and our role in it. Paul's next step after the Christ hymn is to remind the people of the importance of humility and obedience as the church's mission and mandate. As Christ obeyed, so are the members of the church. By imitating Christ, they will be equipped for their mission. Paul gives this model of obedience and lifestyle through the lens of himself and through Timothy and Silvanus. And Paul calls for self-sacrificial love that occurs not only in the hymns, but also in concrete life in people that they know well. In chapter 3, we see Paul going after the dogs, not Khaleesi, who's laying here very sweetly, and not probably real people that are in Philippi yet. These are probably the rival missionaries that he's talking about in other books, in other places that could come. This is a warning about other teachers that will come through and encourage Jewish law continuance, which we've established is not necessary through his other writings. Paul reminds everyone that through the Christ event and through imitating Christ, like we're called to do in chapter 2, then we are brought into the fold in the promise of God. And with this lovely roundup, we have this really climactic appeal for unity in the community in the beginning of chapter 4. There are 2 people, Euodia and Synecdoche, and both are leaders who have worked alongside and struggled alongside Paul, and they're going to be leaders, and they should be greeted. And these women are workers alongside the community, and they will help the congregation remain on the proper path and maintain the unity of the congregation. And with that, Paul ends as he began with a note of thanksgiving for their support and the relationship that he has with the Philippians and the gifts and graces that God has given them. That was quite an introduction to the works of Paul, and so I will bid you a good night or a good morning and say this to you in a slightly less eloquent way. I am grateful for you, for the works that you do in the name of Christ, the gifts and graces that the Spirit has given to you, and the community that you are and continue to become as you are imitators of Christ. Bye, everybody.